afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this webinar today. I would like to invite the chair of the India Center, Professor Pankaj Jain, to kindly introduce our speaker for the webinar.
Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, Dr. Shwansari Basu Chaudhary, and I'm extremely delighted to welcome Professor Shonaleeka Kaul from JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, India, whom I met about a dozen years ago in her campus. I think that time you were at DU probably, if I remember correctly. And I'll start with her bio note, then she'll take over, and you'll be delighted with her Sanskrit presentation in Sanskrit about Sanskrit language. Professor Shonaleeka Kaul is India's leading cultural and intellectual historian, specializing in Sanskrit literature. She is Professor, Center for Historical Studies, JNU, and has also been the Malathi Singh Distinguished Lecturer in South Asian Studies at Yale University, the Jan Gonda Fellow in Indology at Leiden University, and Visiting Professor of History at Heidelberg University in Germany. She is author of Imagining the Urban, Sanskrit and the City in Early India, The Making of Early Kashmir, Landscape and Identity in the Rajatarangini, and Bharat Before the British and Other Essays, her latest monograph towards a new Indology. She has edited another 4 volumes, including Eloquent Spaces, Meaning and Community in Early Indian Architecture, Retelling Time, Alternative Temporalities from Pre-Modern South Asia, and Myths and Place, New Perspectives in Indian Cultural Geography. Also, translations by her include Hitopadesh and Looking Within, Life Lessons from Lal Ded, the Kashmiri Shaiv Mystic. She has been invited to speak widely around the world, including at Sorbonne, Paris, Spinoza, Rome, Stanford, USA, Freie University, Berlin, Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, Australian National University, Canberra, University of Michigan, US, University of Kent and Liverpool, UK, the World Sanskrit Conference, Bangkok and Canberra, and the United Nations, Geneva, among other international fora. Welcome, Dr. Kaul.
Namaskar, and thank you very much, Professor Jain and Flame University, for this very warm invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I'm not terribly well today, so apologies in advance if I'm not fully myself. It may be fair to say that ours is a country where an incredibly rich linguistic heritage, far from occasioning more than rhetorical pride, becomes often the pretext for politics. Even as most of them struggle for patronage and survival, Indian languages, classical or vernacular, ancient or medieval, are found routinely reduced in public discourse to little more than instruments of power and conflict. A case in point is Sanskrit. In ironic contrast to the enormous prestige Sanskrit enjoyed as a language of all learning and culture throughout her millennia-long pre-modern career across South, Central, and Southeast Asia, today this prolific tongue has come to be understood as merely of ritual and repression. Therefore, it is regarded by some as redundant to the secular and emancipated sensibilities of the modern age. This is, however, a woefully inadequate understanding of the vast and variegated repertoire of Sanskrit and the many voices and visions it entails. In my talk today, I hope to flag some of these and thereby clear a bunch of misconceptions about this prodigious literature. Name any knowledge system in the world and you will find a Sanskrit text or an entire genre devoted to it. From metaphysics to erotics, logic to poetics, statecraft to medicine, including veterinary science, from maths and astronomy to painting and architecture, history, law, linguistics, music, ethics, food, some say even theft, Chaura Shastra. The list is endless. Not many know this or have creative exposure and opportunities nowadays to explore Sanskrit's extraordinary intellectual history. Hence, unfortunately, all sorts of misconceptions abound, associating an obscurantism, orthodoxy, and archaism with the tongue. Further, In today's polarized climate, if you are an Indian studying Sanskrit or writing history based on representing and not necessarily bashing Sanskrit, you are liable to earn a particular ideological sobriquet or to be labeled a cultural chauvinist. Putting aside this politics of language, it is important to understand that there is nothing inherently sectarian or hegemonizing in Sanskrit, and to assume so would be highly reductive of its rich history. Languages are not mere instruments of power and politics. They are the fecund medium for the transmission and preservation of enormous flows of knowledge. And if anything, they may embody plural perspectives, critical voices, and debates. For example, Sanskrit treatises, shastras, on any subject typically employ a dialogic form where a Purva Paksha and an Uttara Paksha, that is, different points of view essentially, are presented and interrogated. Plays and poetry, kavya, on the other hand, often expose and indict various forms of authority in early India. You have only to read a Kalidasa or a Shudraka to hear the Sanskrit literature speak truth to power, or a Bilhana and a Kalhana to glimpse the contempt in which they held almighty kings. Consider this verse from Bilhana's Vikramanka Deva Charita, which is the biography of the 11th century Chalukyan king of Kalyan. The verse goes, Kim charu charitra vilasa shunyaha purvanti bhupaha kavi sangrahen Kim jatu gunja phala bhushananam suvarnakarena vane charanam. That is, when their own accomplishments are few and far between, why ever do kings gather around them great poets? What need, indeed, would berry-wearing forest dwellers have for goldsmiths in residence? Unquote. Given that ancient poets typically depended on the court for patronage, caricaturing the king thus was a brave and risky thing to do. And yet they did it. Similarly, you have texts like the Chaturbhani, a set of hilarious, at times bawdy, highly satirical monologue plays from the 5th century. Or you have Mahendra Varman's 7th century Mattavilasa Prahasanam, Damodar Gupt's 9th century Kuttani Mata, or Kshemendra's Deshopadesh from the 11th century, all of which lampoon social hypocrisies generally and pompous members of society overly conscious of their status in particular. If you actually read these texts, there's nothing archaic about them. They would resonate so strongly with us. And they didn't need modern intellectuals telling them to do this, undertake this critique. This capacity for self-satire on the part of Sanskrit authors has not got quite the notice it deserves. Indeed, kavyas, which happen to be my area of study, do not always appear committed to reproducing hierarchies of wealth, gender, visual authority, and monarchy, but instead may critique them in the interests of perceived fairness. The concerns and vantages of some of these texts could extend to the underdog, the menial, the criminal, the rebel, even the quote-unquote feminist, etc., as I have detailed in my book, Imagining the Urban. Kavyas portray the city, in fact, as the place that saw the ascendance of essentially amoral structures of power, like commercial wealth on the one hand and the monarchical state on the other, and an intense social heterogeneity is the subject of these portrayals. All of these put together would, on its own, render attenuated the hold of any homogenizing behavioral norm. It is Sanskrit Kavya that gives us glimpses of the city's demographic and ideological unorthodoxy. They yield an understanding of the city as a multiverse, where spheres of abundance and deprivation, hedonism and prudery, culture and crudeness, patriarchal conformity and subversion, coercion and resistance, tradition and transgression, all coexisted and overlapped. Clearly, Sanskrit writers were not passive, quote, housebirds of patricians, as Didi Kosambi provocatively called them, simply mouthing what the ruling class of the day may have wanted to hear and complicitly furthering ideologies of domination. The narratives in Sanskrit literature are far more complex and profound than that, and present a polyphony of worldviews, if only we are willing to listen and to not succumb to the somewhat modern hubris of arrogating to ourselves, that is, intellectuals today, the quality of enlightened radicalism, but being loath to extend any such possibility to our forebears. In fact, not just kavyas, other Sanskrit texts and genres present commentaries on unorthodox or even transgressive attitudes and behavior, not to be fashionably provocative, but to sagaciously engage with and complicate the question of what, after all, constitutes right or wrong for society, rather than propagating any dogma. So complicating these questions rather than laying out a dogma. I can't emphasize this enough because of the kind of rigidity and conservatism that are often associated today with Sanskrit. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana are outstanding examples, perhaps, of this. They take up questions of legitimacy at every step in their complex plots, not exempting even gods from such an interrogation. Sri Rama's murder of Bali and Sri Krishna's use of a half-truth to weaken the enemy warrior Drona come to mind. The Srimad Bhagavad Gita, in fact, is nothing but an engagement with profound individual and social dilemmas, placing them in the transcendent perspective of universal good. The larger aim of the epics was perhaps moving towards a more ethical order for the individual and the community at large. Now, speaking of ethics and the epics, we know that the Mahabharata and Ramayana are designated by a specific genre in Sanskrit known as itihasa, literally thus it was. Now, tradition defines itihasa as dharmartha kama mokshanam upadesha samanvitam katha yuktam puravrittam itihasam prachakshate. Tales of the past rendered in a narrative style, katha yuktam, containing instruction, upadesha, in the four goals of life, piety, power, pleasure, and liberation, is known as history. Ladies and gentlemen, this offers perhaps one of the earliest explicit definitions of history, which shows that a literary and socio-ethical pedagogy may have been at the heart of Sanskrit's vision of the discipline. This robust civilizational definition of history is at some variance from the modern Western empiricist notion of it, the Rangian notion of it, if you like, assigning quite a different value and function, that of the instructive and the didactic, to history. And this cultural specificity and virtuosity needs to be recognized and respected rather than dismissed for its alterity to Western hegemonic notions. However, the presence of myths in the epics has, among other reasons, led historians to deny them the status of history proper, thereby defying the tradition's self-understanding as itihasa. But what is myth? Dubbed irrational, primitive, superstitious, undateable, and untrue, myth has often been discredited by modern historians who see it not as the self-expression of a people, but typically as a veiled or ulterior project of one kind of domination or another. I believe it is time to depart from these interpretations and rehabilitate myth not as history's primeval other, nor as an instrument of power and acculturation, but as communitarian mechanisms by which societies made sense of themselves and their world and put out what was noble and true in their worldview. I should add that Paul Vane has made the same argument for ancient Greek and Roman myths, that they were not about the real as true, they were about the noble as true. And I've talked at great length about myth in an entire volume that came out last year. It's called Myths and Places, New Perspectives in Indian Cultural Geography, and I hope those interested would have the occasion to look at it. Thus, in addition to a wealth of historical and anthropological detailing of real polities and peoples in the epics, I should underline this. It's ironic for texts that we are calling mythology, that they're actually documenting, they're taking the pains to actually document in a lot of detail, ad nauseum, in fact, a number of very historical and anthropological phenomena in early India, whether they are the polities, the Janapadas, or the peoples, the Jana. But in addition to all of this, piercing through even the mythology in the epics, and in fact facilitated by it, at the heart of both epics are meta-historical questions of ethics and action and socio-political legitimacy. And these questions then merge with the divinity of the two central protagonists, Sri Krishna and Sri Ram. If I may dwell a few minutes more on history, since it is the field I technically belong to, further exemplifying Sanskrit's vision of history is, of course, my favorite, Kalhan's Raj Tarangani from the 12th century in Kashmir. Now, the Raj Tarangani is classic epic poetry, Mahakavya or Prabandha, regarded erroneously as the first true work of history in all of Sanskrit literature. I have gone into great detail about this in various other places, so I shan't elaborate on why I say erroneously. While most scholarship on the Raj Tarangani, that is about 200 years of such scholarship, has valorized its empiricist qualities like chronology, objectivity, and I must put that within quotation marks, and causality. In my book, which is The Making of Early Kashmir, I have drawn attention to Kavyas and the Raj Tarangani's poetic and figurative aspects instead. In other words, I argue that it is history not despite being Sanskrit poetry, but because of it. For, according to tradition, the poet, Kavi, was also a seer, rishi, who possessed omniscience and divine sight, divya drishti. Now, howsoever cliched this might be, we have to take a tradition seriously if we have to understand it. The Nirukta, which is circa 5th century BCE, and perhaps one of the earliest extant texts on etymology that we have, it defines the Kavi as Kranta Darshano Bhavati, that is, the one with penetrating sight. With this power, which arose from poetic intuition, pratibha, Kavis could gauge the real nature of things and even apprehend different dimensions of time. Now, from the Nirukta in the 5th century BCE, cut to 1700 years later, the Kavyanushasana of Hemachandra in the 12th century CE, what you get is a remarkable show of semantic continuity. This text in the 12th century is saying the same thing. Quote, none a poet, Kavi, who is not also a seer, rishi. A rishi is so called because of his vision, darshana, which is knowledge of the true nature of entities and their varied states of being. And it is because of his vision of the truth, I'm still quoting, it is because of his vision of the truth that the rishi is declared a kavi. The meaning of the word kavi is derived from his capacity for vision, darshana, as well as his powers of description, varnana, unquote. Now, it's not just Hemachandra. Kalhana virtually echoes this when he says, Sat kavi krityam andham jagatvam vina. So you have to remember, we are looking at a deeply intertextual universe when we are talking Sanskrit texts. So they are informed by other texts. And none of them is truly a flash in the pan, as sometimes modern historians have mistakenly believed them to be, thereby extracting and disembedding them from their literary culture. I believe this is what the Rajtarangani has been the subject of. It has tended to be excluded as some kind of noble exception, noble but flawed exception in all of Sanskrit literature. Whereas when you actually read the text, all nearly 8,000 verses of it, you find that it was not doing anything special, but actually bringing together, prodigiously perhaps, a wide variety of other intertextual traditions from the world of Sanskrit. But let me come back to what Kalhan says about history and the poet. So he says, Sat kavi krityam andham jagatvam vina. The world is in darkness without the illumining work of the good poet. So the poet as the primary surveyor of hermeneutics. It is the poet who will interpret reality, the world, and the past for you. Now he says, quote, who else is capable of making visible pratyakshatam, bygone times, except the poet creator, Kavi Vedhas or Kavi Prajapati, who can make delightful productions, Ramya Nirmana, unquote. Here is an explicit Indic belief in the poet's creative ability to make the unobservable past perceptible, pratyakshatam. And I don't need to labor on the point that this is the quintessentially historical function or certainly aspiration to make a bygone time visible again, as it were. Now, this claim to epistemic authority rendered such poetry the lamp that illumines past realities, kavya deepam bhutavastu prakashikam, as Kavi Shrivara says in the 15th century, and he was Kalhan's successor. In other words, history in the poetic mode was essentially a socio-ethical pedagogy. And this is what constituted true knowledge of time and human action in this vision. For the Rajtarangani, the area of instruction was specifically political ethics, that is Rajadharma, with the aim of ensuring social order, yojanam, and people's welfare, praja anupalanam. That is a recurrent refrain in this sprawling text. And if you read just the prayojana, which is just the introductory part, where the poet is actually telling you what he is doing in this text, there he very clearly says, iti prativrittantam lakshanam, that this will be the feature of every tale that I tell in this work of mine, that praja anupalanam, people's welfare is supreme. And how was this to be achieved? Through the cultivation of a series of personal and political values to which the king's commitment was expected, namely good conduct, sat, righteousness, generosity, dakshanya, discriminating intellect, sara viveka, which encouraged men of merit, character, and learning. Please note, merit, character, and learning. And the will to enforce justice, dharma, and ensure fearlessness, abhaya, among the subjects. These are the range of qualities that Kalhana expects of kings. What's more, these values then became the principle for organizing Kashmiri history in Kalhan's text through a series of exemplars that he identified in kings of Kashmir over the centuries, clubbing them in pairs, elucidating their comparative morality. Quite simply put, good versus bad rulers. But what is the crucible of judging what is good governance? It is prajanupalanam. And what is bad governance? Prajapedanam, or the exploitation of the people, the persecution of the people. Now, given this organizing principle, the entire Raj Tarangani, which literally means river of kings, and history itself can be understood as a flow of ethical exemplars. That's not all. The Kavi also provides a profound critique of power and of the evanescence of time by espousing vairagya or detachment as the ultimate end of life. And this is indeed reflected in the rasa, the aesthetic flavor that Kalhana actually explicitly chooses to compose his work in, which is the Shanta rasa, which tallies with detachment or vairagya. To give just a very quick example of how he's actually advocating this kind of detachment, a very philosophical remove from the doings of the world. He says at one point, quote, "The Lord of Lanka, Ravana, suffered a rout from lower animals." This is reference to Vanaras, right? Rama's Vanara Sena. "The Lord of the Kurus, Duryodhana, received a kick on the head. Thus everyone has a mischance, stripping him of his exalted rank as if he were a commoner. So who indeed can afford to be high and mighty, and obsessed with oneself, persist in conceit? Even after realizing the transient nature of existence, asthayinim sthitim, fools do not give up ambition. But on the same path of death is every individual plunging headlong. I am the slayer and he the slain. The notion of a difference between the two lasts but a short while." And here you can hear the clear echoes of the Bhagavad Gita. "He who but yesterday exults while slaying his foe, at the end sees an enemy gloating over him himself when he is himself about to be killed. How awful! Fie on this blinding illusion. Dhikkayo." Unquote. Thus again we see the ethical and the didactic at the heart of Sanskrit's engagement with history and the world. Facts alone did not exhaust truth in this perspective. Ethicizing reality and transcending socio-moral and spiritual shortcomings was perhaps more the goal. Now, the same for aesthetics. Sanskrit Kavyalankar was inflected self-consciously by a didactic mandate to accomplish three aims. One, generate priti and harsha, that is entertainment. Two, lokasya anukarana, that is mimesis or imitation of the world, so a certain realism. And three, upadesha, instruction on a range of human affairs, again, like in the definition of history, dharma, artha, kama. So piety, power, pleasure, very broadly defined. So from Bharata in the 2nd century, who uses the term upadesha in the Natya Shastra, and Bhama in the 5th century, who spoke of vechakshanya, which is an understanding or an expertise, to Bhoja in the 11th century, who used the term adhyayam, or what is the lesson. And of course, the iconic Abhinav Gupta in his 11th century Abhinav Bharati, who wrote in no uncertain terms that, quote, "the end result of the savoring of rasa is instruction in dharma and the other ends of humankind," unquote. At the heart of Sanskrit aesthetics, thus, was a distinct concern for the social. Now, this is contrary to misconceptions in certain circles today, labeling Sanskrit literary culture as elitist and rarefied, having little to do with the wider world. Let us interrogate this assumption in this last section of my talk vis-a-vis Sanskrit drama, that is Natya. Now, Natya is a subgenre of Kavya. Who was Sanskrit drama or Natya composed for? Now, there is no doubt that any literature that requires a great degree of learning and leisure to compose would have been patronized or cultivated by affluent individuals. So you have kings, ministers, or wealthy magnates, and we hear of them in the kavyas as well as the sponsors. We must beware, however, of confusing or collapsing patron and audience. This is because, as the Natya Shastra itself tells us, Sanskrit plays were performed at festivals, among other occasions, in public places like temples and city squares. Indeed, Bhavabhuti's 9th century play Malati Madhav spells out the locale thus, quote, a large conclave of men, of people, Mahajan Samajaha, coming from different quarters, Nanadi Gantavastavyo, has gathered here for the festival of Lord Kalapriyanath, and I am ordered by the assembly of the learned, Vidvat Jana Parishad, to entertain them by the performance of some new play. Unquote. So many things to note in just this one testimony. A Mahajan Samaja, a large crowd has come to watch the play. It is not some small esoteric circle. They have come from diverse locations and quarters, Nanadi Gantavastavyo. And finally, there is a clear distinction being made between the audience and the Vidvat Jana Parishad, that is the sponsors of that play. Similarly, Vijaya's 8th century Kaumudi Mahotsava alludes to the autumn public festival as the occasion on which it is being performed. And how does she describe this public festival? Sarva Jana Samanya Mahotsava. The festival that is open to Sarva Jana, Samanya, to all common people. Similarly, Kalidas's 4th century Malvikagni Mitra refers to the spring festival in similar fashion. Interestingly, Bana's 7th century Harsha Charita, which is a biography, it's not a play, but it vividly describes such festivals and calls them occasions where the high and the low mingle. So Arya and Arya, where they actually mingle. Then types of plays like the Vithi, street play, Bhana, erotico-comic monologue, and Prahasan, farce, with their lively, irreverent, often vulgar body content, are suggestive of general lay audiences, especially Vithi, like a street play and so on, at least in conception. Moreover, the Natya Shastra explicitly describes drama as the 5th Veda, Panchamam Vedam, for all classes of society, Sarva Varnikam. So it makes it a point to say that. Far from envisaging, as it is often claimed, a purely connoisseurial audience, this text speaks of the presence of various categories of viewers across a spectrum in the audience of plays. In fact, there is explicitly even a reference to fools, murkha, and to children in the theatre. So a far cry from a kind of, again, a closed or controlled or very aristocratic or connoisseurial audience. Now, it is true that the Natya Shastra first prescribes a list of qualities like high birth, good character, learning, a sensitive nature for a viewer. But this is clearly only an ideal, as the text goes on to realistically observe that, quote, all these various qualities are not known to exist in any single spectator, unquote. So it's really this, I think this is a recurrent motif that we can keep in mind for any early Indian studies, that we need to distinguish the ideal from the real or the idealized from the real. In fact, the Natya Shastra admonishes that a play should, quote, contain no obscure and difficult word, good shabdartha hina. Good shabdartha hina. So no obscure and difficult word, and be intelligible to country people, unquote. The Natya Shastra's final inclusive take on the matter of audience is that, quote, different are the dispositions of women and men, young and old, who may be of the superior, middling, and inferior type, and on such dispositions, the success of drama rests, unquote. So a variety of audiences and sensibilities is conceived of in the Natya Shastra. Or, as Kalidas puts it, again in his Malvikarnimitra, Bhinna ruchir janasya ekamapi aradhanam. Drama is entertainment for a variety of people with very different tastes, unquote. Clearly, we need to rethink Sanskrit as an exclusionary language of little social interest or relevance. Let us also remember the highly visual component of theatre, where dialogue, vachika, was only one out of 4 modes of histrionic representation, the others being gestural, angika, that is movements of the face, the limbs, and the body, sartorial and makeup, that is aharya, and significatory, sattavika, tears, horripilation, shivering, etc. Words were to be sung or recited to a variety of meters, accompanied by dance motion. So, not for nothing was drama known as drishya kavya, visual literature. Therefore, learning was not prerequisite for the consumption of this kind of literature, even if it was for its creation. What's more, the actors and actresses, nata, nati, traditionally belonged to low class and caste. They still seem to have done justice to these plays and presumably to the laborious instructions of the Natya Shastra, all of which suggests the popular and heterogeneous, not aristocratic, character of theatre in early India. And this would definitely have shaped the reception of the ideas and representations in plays, especially those that were critical of wrongdoing authority or orthodoxy, which we have seen in so many plays. Thus, Sanskrit's socially engaged character for the world at large is reiterated. Finally, now, let me address one last crucial misconception about Sanskrit. It is believed to have been not a spoken tongue, but an esoteric language of learning. To quote Thomas Burrow, he wrote in this path-breaking volume edited by A.L. Basham called The Cultural History of India, he said that it is the language particularly of the Brahmin caste and of its religion. Relatedly, it is believed by many others too that in the plays and indeed in early Indian society, Sanskrit was spoken only by high status men, while lowly characters and women spoke Prakrit. In other words, a linguistic hierarchy corresponding to a socio-economic hierarchy is envisaged in a lot of scholarship on early India. Now, this is such a neat and persuasive interpretation that the fact that there are telling exceptions drops from view. The Vidushaka, for example, he is the jester and he is the hero's companion in the Sanskrit plays. Now, he is consciously shown as a Brahman, though actually he is then characterized as epitomizing everything that is the opposite of a Brahman. So no education, no sophistication, no nothing, possibly not even literacy. Now, he is consciously shown as a Brahman, projected as one, but always speaks in Prakrit. And I have discussed this in my book, Imagining the Urban, that why is this so? Because comedy is deemed the voice of wisdom. But it is being conveyed in Prakrit. Merchants and courtiers, other high status men, are also required to speak in Prakrit, according to the Natya Shastra. On the other hand, Parivrajikas, that is ascetics, are women, but they use Sanskrit, even though queens usually do not. And courtesans may. Children, even when male and high caste speak only Prakrit. So what is going on here? Clearly, there is no set stock socioeconomic formula for how languages are being distributed in the plays. In fact, the section on languages in the Natya Shastra clarifies the actual grounds for allocating tongues in drama. Everything from characterization, ethnicity, and vocation of protagonists to regional phonetic peculiarities of audiences, as well as blanket considerations like special times and situations, quote unquote. Clearly, Kavya, Natya, aesthetics in Sanskrit, their understanding of language use was a self-conscious one, but the logic was not baldly reflecting social status. Now, this is reinforced by the fact that the 8th century Kavya Darsha, an influential treatise on Kavya composition by Dandin, refers to both Sanskrit and Prakrit as Shishta. Shishta, grammatically disciplined and systematized, and regards both as tongues fit for poetic composition, so that no literary privilege is really inherent in one or the other. We need to be clear about this. The Kavyadarsh does describe Sanskrit as Devi Vak, so divine speech. But this seems to have been on account of it being perfected speech. Anvakyata rishibhihi, worked out by the sages. Indeed, it is this perfection and precision that explain why some today regard it even as an ideal choice for computer programming or for artificial intelligence. It seems to fit that kind of coded precision very well. At the same time, the term that ancient grammarians used for Sanskrit, namely bhasha, from bhasha, that is that which is spoken, suggests that its knowledge may have been more commonplace than we imagine, though its correct or eloquent application would have been confined to the learned, as with all languages even today. The Natya Shastra does speak of Sanskrit and Prakrit as dvividham, the two ways of recitation in what? In the common language which relates to the four castes. Jati bhasha ashrayam chatur varnya samashrayam. Now that is some commentary. Ladies and gentlemen, though this has hardly been a comprehensive survey of the matter, and there is much debate on these issues, I hope my talk today suffices to question rigid and erroneous notions about India's earliest languages. The evidence seen together, there is clearly a need to rethink Sanskrit as a rarefied language and literary culture of little reach or relevance to society. I would argue that Sanskrit literature was centrally and persistently engaged with the social, but in ways that surprise and thwart modern day presuppositions. For those of you who wish to read more about this, I'm happy to show you my latest book. It's just out, Bharat Before the British and Other Essays Towards a New Indology. It has an entire chapter or essay on this theme. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Really enlightening. And Dr. Chaudhary can probably conduct the Q&A session.
Yeah. If we have some questions for our speaker, we will only take 1 or 2 questions. Okay. Yes, you can ask your question, Mr. Taylor.
I really just want to thank our speaker for a wonderful presentation. I always enjoy your work. Shonaleeka. Thank you so much for that. A very rich presentation. And I love the way you're challenging these fundamental concepts. And it's so hard to dislodge those things that we were taught in first year. And it's so great to get this completely fresh perspective. I don't agree with everything that you have said, but you've provided so much food for thought, and I really look forward to our next conversation. And I'm sorry that that doesn't constitute a question, but I really just wanted to thank you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, McComas. Great to have you with us.
Do we have any more questions or comments? Okay. So in that, okay, we do have another question. Sanhita Joshi says they have two questions. First is Sanskrit is always perceived as a conservative or rigid language, as you said, the language of Brahmanism conveying the notion of dominance of upper on lower. Can you throw some light on the following question? From where does such notion or misconception sprout? Historically speaking, how does this misconception come into existence? And the second question is, this question comes from the point of view of devil's advocate. How come in many of the Sanskrit compositions, be drama or kavyas, the story most of the time revolves around king, princess, or Brahman, such as Charudat in Mrichatika, etc., gods, etc. In other words, can you share few references to the works where Nayak do not belong to class of kings, Brahmans, or gods, etc.? Congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi Ranade. Your first question is a very pertinent one, and it actually needs research on it. Once we clear the weeds, which is once these misconceptions are actually understood to be misconceptions, then we need to proceed to the next step. As you said, why does this happen? Historically, how is this happening in scholarship? So that would take another project of research. But off the top of my hat, it seems to me there are at least two factors at work here. One would be that these are notions that originate among the Orientalist scholars who first come to translate Sanskrit texts into English and other European languages in the 18th and then the 19th century. Now, some of the texts that they actually choose for these translations would fall within the realm of the sacred. So the Bhagavad Gita is one of the first texts that's taken up for translation. And then the next is the Manusmriti. And it is only much later. And the Manusmriti in turn is being translated because it is deemed as, it is represented as, understood and thereby enshrined as some kind of definitive text on early Indic law. Now, when these two texts are being translated, it is only much later that other kinds of works, such as aesthetic works, works of poetry, or even the Raj Tarangani and so on, come to be translated. By then, a certain perception has come into place that therefore only certain categories of thought and certain ideological viewpoints prevail. There is a conflation going on also, I suspect, at this time between European precedents, European historical notions of, say, religion, very Semitic notions, very rigid and defined notions of what religion is on the one hand, and of a papacy or of a clergy that actually was at the head dispensing this religion, which might be true for Catholic Europe, but was not true, supposing, for early Indic society or for Hindu society, which supposing the Manusmriti is taken as representing. So I think these kind of false or erroneous equations subconsciously set into motion via the early interpretive translative efforts. Later, of course, there is no denying, as would apply to all such colonial, imperialist, orientalist endeavors, and not only Edward Said, but a large number of other works have gone on to show us this, that a deep-seated politics underlies these intellectual efforts. Why are the Europeans or the British the Orientalist scholars, great scholars in their own right. But why are they interested in learning Sanskrit and translating these texts in the first place? It is deemed that they are interested in this so as to provide a means to control, as it were, the colonial populace. So there is always a very clear political purpose to both their reading of the text and then their selection of the text. I must underline that the Manusmriti is only one of hundreds of Dharmashastric texts. And moreover, if you actually read the text authentically, you find that it is speaking in polyphonies. There are multiple voices going on there, and one line is deemed to even be contradicted by the very next line in the Manusmriti. When you read the text, you realize this. And this has led scholars to actually... Okay, so I have a dog here who is impatient to be let out. But coming back to the topic, this has led scholars to actually wonder how we should, in what terms should we actually understand and characterize the Manusmriti, given the contradictions it is riven with. And not just contradictions from one line to another, which indicate that multiple views are going on in contestation. There is a contestation at the heart of these texts, which has not come out in either translations or in the subsequent historical scholarship of these texts. There has been a very clear hegemonizing, not so much of what the texts are, not so much in what the texts are saying, but the representation of what these texts are saying. And a clear politics is underlining that. And as I said, it may have been infused European precedents that were playing out. And later, of course, we do have politics of modern India or contemporary India. And some very influential statesmen and thought figures who emerge, who do tend to look at early Indian religious phenomena or religious literature through the lens of certain modern causes. And a lot of this has actually influenced how we read and understand these texts without actually going to them. Your second question, that devil's advocate, how come in many of the Sanskrit compositions? Now, why do they revolve around king, princes, or Brahman? You know what? A good idea would be to actually go and again look at the Natya Shastra's list of Nayakas, who plays the Nayaka and the Nayakas. And also keep in mind that the Nayaka is hardly the only hero in the text, because you have a whole bunch of other characters, supporting actors if you like, but they are actually instrumental in executing a critique of the Nayaka. Now, this is very important. This sheds a completely different light on the choice of the Nayaka as either a god or a Brahmin or a king. And the list is not confined to this. I will just come to that as well. But this is very important, that when the Nayaka is shown to be this figure of some kind of authority or the other, either political or ritual or so on, he is then being critiqued rather than actually being endorsed for his behavior and his choices. So I repeat what I said at the beginning of this talk, that Sanskrit literature is far from simplistic. It actually engages in complicating the story, the plot, and the commentary at every level. There are multiple registers playing out in every text that you read, be it a Shastra or a Kavya or a Natya. So you need to ask beyond just what appears on the surface. That is, why is the hero who he is? And is this not also, would this not also apply to many ancient and medieval treatises, ancient and medieval works of fiction around the world, that they were typically about princes, much more than actually Brahmins? Charudat happens to be a Brahman, but look at the way he is lampooned in that text. He's shown to have double standards. He's shown to be to give up his lady love as soon as the heat builds up on him. He's shown to display considerable hypocrisy, actually, social hypocrisy, and I've written extensively about this. So the Mritikatikam is actually a brilliant example of the opposite of the point you are trying to make in your question, because it also contains a beautiful critique of poverty. So sure, he's a Brahman merchant, but one who has fallen on bad days and is actually impoverished. And then he launches on this very detailed soliloquy on the ills of poverty, the social demonization, the social exclusion due to poverty, the social boycotts that he suffers due to his impoverished state, and the psychological effects of poverty, and so on. I think unparalleled discourse. And that is a Sanskrit text where the hero is, on the face of it, a representative of a higher order. Then his own Vidushaka actually is perennially, at every point, he is showing how he is wrong, how the hero is wrong in his choices, in his actions. The fact that he goes after a courtesan, even when he has a faithful, committed wife at home. So all these points are being made explicit in the text. They are not shying away from, as I said repeatedly in my talk, from actually showing you the other side, the dark side of the moon, even if their choice of characters were from higher orders. In fact, especially because their choice of characters were from higher orders. But one last point, again, the Mritikatikam has a character like Shonaleeka. Now, who is he? Again, a Brahmin, again reduced to penury in the city of Ujjaini. And what does he undertake in the process? Theft. So you actually see Shonaleeka, dramatically, the entry of Shonaleeka is as a thief who is cutting a hole in the wall of a house to go in and steal from somebody's house. And in case you have missed the irony of that, the author, the poet, Shudraka, underlines this point by a beautiful verse where he says that this thief, to measure the hole in the wall that he's making, what does he use? He uses his upanayan, he uses his janeu, which is the highly sacred ritual symbol of his Brahmanhood. And what is it being reduced to in conditions of urban poverty and in a classic Sanskrit play? To a symbol of theft. If that is not the most complex and sophisticated, multi-layered commentary on a social reality which was also equally complex and multi-layered, I don't know what would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shonaleeka and Samhita. Thank you for this elaborate response and wonderful talk. The second question actually came from the point of view of devil's advocate, as I wrote. So many a times this misconception comes up again and again. So wanted to just know your perspective on that, and thank you for this response.
No, good question. I think this kind of questioning and counter questioning is required for really clearing the brain from the chaff. A kind of chaff that we have, like McComas said, we have actually been dealing with that chaff for at least 2 centuries. So it's very important to have these kind of dialogues. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Professor Kaul, I know we are already running out of time, and I mean, we have so many questions, I'm sure, goes on to show how popular this talk was. But we'll take just one last question by K. Swami. Would the inclusive character of Sanskrit dramas assumed or anticipated audience, as you nicely described from Bharatanatyam Shastra, keeping in mind the 4 aspects of drama, allow us to imagine that a wider knowledge of Sanskrit and Prakrit than usually assumed could have existed?
Yes, I did suggest that in my talk. Thank you for catching that. I did suggest that since the plays are attested as being public performances before audiences that are heterogeneous, and then also containing representations that are transgressive, that are questioning, that are provocative, and to, like I said, being played out also by actors and actresses who are in themselves not from high caste or class. I think all of this adds up to the definitely, number one, a mutual intelligibility between Sanskrit and Prakrit speakers. So this hierarchy that only the higher members of society would have understood Sanskrit, then what were the lower orders doing when the Sanskrit dialogues were being spoken? Are you saying that they could not follow that? I think there is a mutual intelligibility clearly, and the grammatical texts are also endorsing that Sanskrit and Prakrit, there is no hierarchy in that. But your question relates to whether they were known and spoken more widely than has been assumed. I am arguing that. I am not a linguist. I'm not a grammarian. I know the limits of my expertise and of my argumentation. I do raise this point as a historian, and I think it's important. I think some questions have not been answered. I think a lot has been assumed about the status of these languages and of their language use in early India. So I certainly argue for rethinking that. And I think that needs more research. There is also a school of thought among Sanskritists that says that Sanskrit and Prakrit were in a diglossic relationship. So a diglossia existed, that Sanskrit is merely a higher register of speaking, and Prakrit is a different, a more colloquial, a more domesticated, a more vernacular, more casual register of speaking, but broadly within the same linguistic family. And this would also explain the mutual intelligibility that we are talking about, that the same audience has to have followed. Oh, sorry, I should have mentioned, Sanskrit plays have large portions which are in Prakrit, right? So a number of the dialogues are being spoken in Prakrit. So are you telling me that only one half of the audience, the higher ones, that were following both parts, and the other half of the audience could not? Clearly, everybody was figuring out what is going on in the play, which was bilingual. So there is a lot that we haven't understood yet, I think, about both Sanskrit and Prakrit in the process. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Professor Kaul. Professor Jain, any concluding thoughts?
Can I take my host privilege and ask you a small question? You can be really brief if you will.
Sure.
What would be your explanation of why Buddha and Mahavir both chose apparently not to speak in Sanskrit, but they preferred Prakrit and Pali or Pali? Thank you.
Well, this is interesting because we also know that who is the audience? Who is the early audience of the Buddha and the Mahavir? What are the social circles in which the Buddha and the Mahavir are moving? Uma Chakravarti did this wonderful work called Social Dimensions of Early Buddhism, where she actually showed that 80%, as much as 80% of the initial quote-unquote converts to Buddhism, or at least members of the Sangha, in the Buddha's own time, were Brahmins. Number one. Number two, we also know very clearly from the Buddha and Mahavir's life stories that they are themselves from the higher order. They are themselves princes. And number three, some of their earliest followers to whom they actually go around propagating and moralizing were also kings. The great kings, the quintessential kings of the what's called second urbanization, that is 6th century BC, the Sholash Mahajanapada, all the kings of those Janapadas were the targets, were the initial, and they were good friends of the Buddha and Mahavir as well. So their own social location is hardly subaltern. Where are we then presuming? Why are we then presuming that these language choices that they made were necessarily because they represented a subaltern community, or they were speaking to a subaltern community? They were not. We have evidence that they were not. They were speaking to all kinds of people, right from the top downwards. So I think, again, there is a need for, when you look at the Kavya Darsh, for example, or when you look at other works of Kavya composition, how do they take up this linguistic question? I repeat, they do not assert a hierarchy among them. They present these languages as simultaneous coexisting choices. So my point to you would be, why does Ashoka write his edicts in Prakrit, right? Why is he not doing it in Sanskrit? Does Sanskrit not exist? Then of course it existed. So why is he still resorting to Prakrit? And again, the kind of a sort of reflexive response is that, because the people could speak only Prakrit, and he wanted them to follow. But recent scholarship has actually shown us that the places where Ashoka's edicts are actually inscribed are not even within the sight of vision, the line of vision of someone standing at ground level. They're actually inscribed on pillars or on rock surfaces that are high up. And scholarship now believes, scholarship on Ashoka, that they were never actually being read by the common people themselves. They were being read out by functionaries of the state who are entrusted with the task of communicating the message of the king to the populace. In other words, we still do not know about the levels of literacy and which language the commoners knew and used. we are still only operating within a broadly upper class that we are looking at, whether it's the functionaries of the state, whether it's the kings and princes, or preachers of thought systems like the Buddha and Mahavir, who are themselves from aristocratic families. None of them is a commoner. So what is our basis for presuming? I think our basis is yet another theory, yet another assumptive theory that has been floated, and again, very influential, that Buddhism and Jainism itself were counter movements to some kind of elitist Brahmanical religion. Whereas when you read the original thought of these intellectuals, I believe they are intellectuals, supreme intellectuals, the Buddha and the Mahavir, you find that they are perennially engaging with the very same categories and notions of thought that, say, the Upanishads are, or that, say, the Vedas are. They're also engaging with the question of who is the Brahmin. They're not rejecting the Brahmin, they're not rejecting the social order, the so-called Hindu social order at all. In fact, the only thing they do is they invert number 1 and number 2. So they say the Khatriyas or the Kshatriyas will be number 1 and the Brahmins come number 2. And why? Because they themselves are Khatriyas or Kshatriyas. So I think there's a lot of fog that has been generated around all these questions, and many very easy kind of equations have been resorted to between language use, social status, the function of these early religions like Jainism and Buddhism, characterizing them as social reform movements. Whereas we know, for example, the Buddha's own prescriptions on women. We know that this was not a social reform movement for including women, whereas it has often been represented as that, or as a reform movement for the lower orders. Whereas again, if it's a reform movement for the lower orders, how come 80% of the initial followers are from the top orders? Clearly, we are missing something. We are missing something very crucial. And I believe that is that these were essentially thought movements. They were not social reform movements. They were intellectual responses and dialoguing that was going on, and not confined to just Buddhism and Jainism on the one hand and Brahmanism or Hinduism on the other. You had multiple cross currents of thought at that time. It was a very vibrant social setting. We should not be reducing it to a certain lens with which I think historians have tended to see early India.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Wonderful. Anybody else, Sanchari, or I'll leave it to Sanchari and you too.
We do have one more question, but should we mail this to you, or would you?
It's a short one. I can take it. He's saying, how can Kavya Shastra be used in this time? It depends on what you mean by use. How can they be read? They are being read by translations or in Sanskrit by those who know Sanskrit.
So he has, they have asked the question in 3 parts. So just to give you in context, earlier kings used to have theologians and they used to write epics. How can it be used today?
No, that doesn't help
Okay.
clarify the question even now. I did read that, because what do you mean by use? I come back to that question.
Should I unmute them?
Yeah, okay.
He has left now. He typed the question and then he left.
So how can it be used today?
He's here, yeah.
If you mean how can we interpret these texts today, I would like to believe that is exactly what some of us scholars are trying to do. My first book, called Imagining the Urban, is based entirely on more than 24 kavyas. So we can actually read these texts very much. They are alive and kicking in our midst. We can actually read them very much today for raising a whole range of very interesting questions about social and behavioral and intellectual histories of early India. And I would really like to believe that all my work in the last 25 years has been doing just that. So kavyas can very much be used in lovely ways, evolving suitable methodologies, which is what has been a chief concern with me, that our methodology for reading kavya and for reading any Sanskrit text today must be consistent with and aligned with the traditions of the text itself, or how the text sees itself and sees what it is doing, or puts out what it is doing, rather than looking for what we want the text to be doing. There has to be a difference between the two. Thank you.